I'm here with Professor Bob Lingard, a professorial fellow in the Institute for Learning Sciences and Teacher Education at the Australian Catholic University. Bob is also an Emeritus Professor of Education Policy at the University of Queensland and a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and the UK. Thank you very much, Bob, for making the time today for this conversation.
A pleasure, Barbara, a pleasure.
Bob, I know you have led a great number of body of work over the last 3 to 4 decades on in the field of education and education policy. And given your expertise in this area, I'd like to start by asking you the first question, and that would be about why does it matter to do research and study education policy in the first place?
Yeah, a very good question. I think if we go back historically, I suppose policy was sort of important in schooling systems in many nations. But I think it's about the time from the 1980s on to the present that policy became the way that large schooling systems were managed, the way they were steered. I think we can look in the UK context from the time of the late 70s with Margaret Thatcher, and then in other parts of the world with all of the changes that we've gone through since that time, you know, globalization and the current sort of backlash in some places against it. So I think that from the 1980s, that the steering, actually the very structuring of schooling systems has been through policy. Prior to that, I think, large systems, education systems, particularly in Australia, but in most societies, I think, were managed as large bureaucracies with a sort of technical rationality. I think from the 1980s through the 90s and then into this century, that bureaucratic state structure has been restructured, firstly through new public management. So there was no longer the tight bureaucratic technical rationality, even though aspects of that remained. But the way those at the center, the leadership of the system, steered what was happening out in regions and schools and classrooms became essentially through policy. So I think anyone who wants to understand from the 1980s through to the present about what has happened in education need very, very much to understand policy, because it's what frames up what schools, principals, the leadership in schools, and what teachers in classrooms can do. And so I think policy became centrally important when we had the restructuring of the bureaucratic state in education through new public management, and then subsequently through network governance that Stephen Ball and others have written about. And of course, new public management saw a bit of a thinning out, a steering from the center of schools and teachers' work through particular forms of accountability and policy. And then when we move to network governance, we have private sector actors, edu businesses, edupreneurs, philanthropists, and others becoming part of the production of policy and the policy cycle, but still really important, I think, to steer what happens in schools and classrooms. It's interesting to me, I've been thinking about this a bit, and I did a book earlier this year, an edited book on globalization and education, and the introductory essay there, I wrote about the changes that globalization had upon education policy, which I suppose until the 1980s, education policy was something that was managed inside a nation, inside the subnational units through the bureaucratic state. And I think with globalization, of course, global pressures from international organizations, you know, the World Bank, aid agencies for the developing world, OECD largely for the developed world, even though those two things are changing. So I think what education policy is, there have been real challenges to it from globalization. So whereas once there was full national sovereignty over education policy, I think now there are global effects. There's been an emergence of a global education policy field, and international large-scale assessments like OECD's PISA for development, etc., and the IEA's TIMS and PEARLS play and have huge impact, I think, today within policies of many nations. So there's a global element, not just a national one. And I think that's been interesting in how we research education policy, because I think what we saw was a sort of methodological nationalism, which only saw policy developed inside a nation with the impact of global discourses, policies, testing, etc. Excuse me. We had a move perhaps to a methodological globalism and a neglect of the national. But I think what we've seen, the Trump presidency, Brexit, and other rises of other nationalist movements, we've seen something of a backlash against globalization. And so I think to understand policy today, we need to look at the global effects, the national effects, and look at how they are interwoven and play with each other, I think. If we look at the definition of policy, Fazil Rizvi and I, a long time ago, in our book, Globalisation, Education Policy, argued that if you took Easton's classic definition of policy as the authoritative allocation of values, that globalization had changed authority structures, with authority coming now from international organizations as well as national and subnational one. Allocation linked to the state structure, so the move from the bureaucratic through new public management and network governance has had an impact upon policy and how it's produced, and values, ideologies, discourses. There are globalized ones as well as local ones. But those relations keep changing, of course. And I think we shouldn't just think of the top-down, bottom-up because of the global affecting the national, but the nation and the national in relation to policy has been important in helping to constitute the global field as well. So I hope I've said enough about why it's important to study education policy, because it's an essential factor now in how schooling systems work. There's something on the horizon, and I've got another book coming out with Routledge later this month on datification. And I think the whole top-down test-based accountability and all the data that systems now have on schools and students and teachers, I'll be interested to see as we move into the future how datification, artificial intelligence, and those matters might work as sort of de facto surrogate policy framings. But that's and that's something that's emerging. But I think we'll still retain the policy statements for things which systems deem to be important. Sure. I think I've said enough answering your question, Bhavika, why it's important to study education policy. But of course, it's not the only thing that's important to study. You know, education is a broad field, and various disciplines can be brought to bear to study various aspects of it. But I suppose my frame is coming from the sociological perspective. And I suppose that the focus on education policy almost became a central element in the sociology of education, whereas I think up until the 1980s and 90s, the concern had been mainly with social justice and opportunity in schooling systems.
Yes, and I think, Bob, you pointed to quite a few different and important trends impacting on education policy. My next question, and you also talked about datafication as well as pressures for greater accountability on what teachers do, and this is where I would like to lead the conversation next in terms of what you think is the nexus between policy and practice, especially when it comes to what teachers and educators do in school settings on a day-to-day basis. How do you see this connection between policy and practice?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And I think if we thought in a way of quite an old-fashioned debate within sociology of structure and agency, I suppose crudely we could see the policy frame and the restructured state as setting the context and setting the frameworks for practice within schools. But having said that, I would suggest that school leaders and teachers, despite their being pushed in particular directions from policy and having to do certain things according to policy, I think there is also still some autonomy there. Now, I know there's been a lot of devolution of things to school sites within the restructured state framed by new public management network governance. But I'm talking about more a sort of professional autonomy. And I think there is something that potentially is still irreducible about that. And I know when I've researched in schools in respect of, say, the place of NAPLAN, the place of the national curriculum, I found in, say, some of the large coastal cities in Queensland that high schools and primary schools in the same city, if you go and look how they're enacting the national curriculum framed by Queensland issues within that, they're all doing it in fractionally different ways, which would seem to indicate that there's still some autonomy, professional autonomy. I think the other sort of autonomy that accompanies devolution of a lot of functions to school sites is linked to a new form of accountability, which is we give you the space to achieve what we set in the central sort of policy frame. But I think, so if you thought about the national curriculum, that sort of frames what teachers do, and national testing does, with the three message systems that Bernstein talked about, curriculum, pedagogy, and assessment. I think while those two things, national curriculum, national testing, NAPLAN, frame up to some extent what schools and teachers and classrooms can do, I also think the pedagogical, there remains some space where teachers can still attempt to do the things that they want to do, given if they had full professional autonomy. And I think NAPLAN's a good case of framing up what teachers do. One of the things I found, which is interesting to me, in some of the highest performing schools in research I've done in Queensland, highest performing on NAPLAN, for a whole host of reasons, they've often struck me as those that give less attention to it because they serve particularly advantaged communities, which they don't have to talk about. So that policy has a differential effect across schools located of different types of schools, but also schools located in different sorts of communities. Whereas I've been into some schools in really poor communities where everything is focused around NAPLAN test scores and so on. So policy is important because it sets the limits and the frames, I think, of what leadership and pedagogies, teacher professional practices in schools can do. But I still think there is a sort of almost irreducible aspect. If you're the teacher in front of the class, policies, yes, are framing what you can do, but there's still some things you can do that you think are right in your professional judgment, which might counter or align with some of the policy directions. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think that's an important point in terms of looking at the spaces where how policies are actually implemented, and it's a rather complex space, as you pointed out. Bob, if I may continue with the next question, and that's perhaps bringing it back to the area of education policy and some of the key emerging areas of research that you have been involved in over the last, perhaps more recent years. How would you describe key areas of research that are emerging in the space of education policy and policy analysis?
Okay, well, as I said in response to your initial question, Babak, I think there's been a lot of research done on the global impacts on national systems and subnational systems. And I'm thinking in particular about the work of the OECD in relation to rich nations, but now, of course, with the development of PISA for development, which is going to be part of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, post-2015 goals. So I've contributed, I think, to a lot of that research, particularly around PISA, but the way the OECD is becoming ever more ambitious about the scope and scale of OECD, a desire almost to cover every system on the globe in terms of measuring performance there. So, and I've done a lot of research in and around that and the way that impacts in different nations in different ways. I've researched the way the media reporting of that functions in particular ways. So as an example, if you think of Australia, constitutionally, despite national curriculum, national testing, NAPLAN, and so on, that constitutionally schooling's a residual responsibility of the states and territories. But when you look at PISA, it reports on Australia's performance. Now, I know we oversample, so we get reports on Victoria, New South Wales, Tasmania, etc. But even discursively, I think the talk of where Australia fits on those international tests, I think helps constitute a national schooling system. So I've done a lot of research around that, and I think we'll see more and more of that because Andreas Schleicher and the Education and Skills Directorate at the OECD is very ambitious. You know that PISA is probably its most successful product, and now we've got all the offshoots: PISA for schools, PISA for development, the PISA for young kids beginning school, and so on. And how that is taken up by nations. But I've written a paper recently, and what I argued in that paper was that the broader political context of the rise of nationalism, ethno-nationalism, a sort of surreptitious racism and white supremacy had given space to education policymakers to push critiques of PISA. And the critiques that were being pushed by the US were too many nations participate, not enough research into the expanding items on the test. So the US, Japan didn't participate in the global competence measure in the last 2018 PISA. Criticisms that they hadn't moved to computer adaptive testing online. And so I think that's interesting in the context of ever-changing imbrications between global effects, national effects, subnational, and so on. So that's one area that I've contributed research to, I think. And if I could say so, I particularly like the large, lengthy introductory essay I've just written in this book that came out earlier this year with Routledge called Globalisation and Education. And it basically looks at changing national-global relations and how that works in education policy. So that's one area I've worked in. Another has been, I suppose, a sort of history of policy and taking the notion of social justice, equal opportunity in schooling systems and tracing what's happened with those sort of concepts, the sort of ideas which motivate and push policy, how that concept has been re-articulated over time in different sort of broader policy regimes with different sorts of governments and so on, and the way that I think a broader definition, which was back there in the Whitlam time, 72 to 75, and about the necessity of redistributing money into poor communities and trying to articulate relationships between curriculum and those kids in those schools and the schools and its community to open up opportunity. Whereas we come right down through to the present, we seem to have a much reduced definition, which really, if you take NAPLAN, equity is defined as having a weaker correlation with SES background, but within NAPLAN, doing better than your 59 other like schools, which have populations like you. And that seems to me to be a very reductive, enumerated construction. And I think we need to look at the impact of the global, and Nancy Fraser in her 2013 book's written about this quite nicely, the impact on the global, on how philosophically we could describe social justice in schooling, and then how we could move to enact it. So one of the things I've been interested in there, and if we go to the classic definition of policy sociology in education, Jenny Osger argued history was one element of that. So I have been interested in the changing definitions, re-articulations of how we think about social justice in education. There's a whole lot of other things that I could talk about in terms of policy, but the thing that's interested me most recently is this rise of numbers and datification, and the possibilities of artificial intelligence, policies, and how algorithms can make predictions out of the intersection of huge data sets, which we can't read from the data sets themselves, and how all of that, and I'm very aware of the criticism Zubov's work on surveillance capitalism, how every day with using our mobile phones and computers, we give up so much data about us, which is then monetized and used for profit making. And how all of that is now working out in schooling is of great interest to me, and something I've been looking at. I wrote with colleagues last year a paper on this for UNESCO, and we've got an edited book that's coming out later this month with Routledge on all of these matters. And I think there is so much to think about in terms of the datification of teachers, datification of students, datification of the system, who provides the infrastructure which enables huge data sets to be put and analysed with algorithms. So I think there is this whole new world emerging, which I think is ahead of us, and I think it's also where edgy businesses are really getting in to the framings of policy and across the entire policy cycle, from agenda setting to the policy production to implementation. And I think there are really important questions to think about there. So I think there's a whole new phenomenon arising, and it's not just policy as numbers and datification, but it is also linked to, I think, forms of privatization, commercialization, the involvement of edgy businesses, and some of the huge ones like Pearson, but the technology companies, Google. And I think then if we look at the impact of COVID on these things, I think they've pushed a lot of that forward. And if we look at, say, New York State, Governor Cuomo has appointed Bill Gates and the former CEO of Google to look at. Governor Cuomo said, this has shown the pandemic that we don't need schools with walls. We've got all this technology. Can't we rethink? And it's interesting to me how he appoints people who aren't educators, but are at the sort of big end of that ed tech, high tech economy. So I think that's an area. So the whole reworking of privatization and commercialization through technology and datification, I think is a huge domain. And there are some people in Australia who are doing outstanding work in this area as well. And I think it is interesting to think about the impact of COVID on education policy, and think about its impact as well on the national global. I think we've seen, to resolve the pandemic, we've got to act globally, but nations have also closed borders. There's vaccine nationalism and a whole range of factors. So I think COVID plays in relation to the way global and national work out and are ever changing in their relationships between each other, and that will impact schooling as well. And I think one of the things that COVID has driven home, that inequalities in the experiences of young people, say in poor families who don't have access to the internet or a laptop, or I think the move to online teaching with teachers working online with young people at home has really starkly pushed forward deep inequalities in the life experience of young people. And an observation that Nick Coldry, who writes about this stratification, made, which really took me aback, and I think he's right. He says, while there are differences in the provision of schooling, school does try to provide equally by differentiating for different young people. But if schooling is located totally within the home, the disparities are much greater than they are between schools. I think that's interesting to think about as well.
Thanks, Bob. I think, as you pointed out, it's really complex, and I think COVID has actually added an extra layer of complexity to the whole discussions and conversation around COVID. Now, around education. Now, if I may continue with the last question, and that perhaps brings me back to the question of globalization and the adverse impacts that globalization has had on education policy and local level. I'm just wondering, from your experience, what are some of the ways, and this might sound like a really tricky and difficult question to answer, what are some of the ways in which we can engage to resist and mitigate some of the negative impacts of globalization on education policy?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And I think at the most macro level, the biggest impact of globalization, and this started in Australia, I think in the 1980s under Hawke Keating governments, that has been a sort of human capital framing of education policy. That is, as under the global, with cuts of tariff and the notion of an emergent global economy, which of course there's resistance against now in the context of COVID, the rise of China, the ethno-nationalism, new nationalisms of Brexit and Trump and so on. But I think that the big impact of globalization is to make education the surrogate de facto economic policy. So about producing the quantity and quality of human capital needed for a competitive national economy in the global one. And I think that's a very reductive, narrow, and I think a lot of the evidence right now in the context of COVID is that what we've seen under the neoliberal is hugely growing inequality within nations and between them. And COVID's pushed this to the fore more starkly. So I think that big framing and the way edu businesses, privatization and so on come in, I think given that, as Apadarai argued, that culture, ethnos, is one of the things that nations still continue to hold on to, education becomes important in that way. And I think it's an explanation for why we have national curriculum and national testing. But these are really big things, big policy things. And I think that resistances to them can only come collectively and collaboratively, through teachers with their teacher unions, through teachers with their professional associations, through particular sorts of think tanks, through particular sorts of interest groups. And I'm just reminded in my own life, I've worked quite closely with teacher unions, and over the last handful of years, I've worked closely with Education International in Brussels, which is the International Federation of Teacher Unions, which represents more than 30 million teachers, and they do wonderful work. I've done research for them on privatisation in Australian schooling. I've done research with the team on what's happening in privatisation in the nation states of the Asia Pacific. And the teacher unions are now more and more doing ARC linkage projects with academics, and I think are recognising more and more. Certainly, Angelo Gavrilatos, who's the president of New South Wales Teachers Federation, he was at the Australian Teachers Union, AEU, and he worked at Education International for a few years. And I've sort of worked reasonably closely with him, and he would argue that teacher union policy has most effect when it has a big research base, and then they can express a collective view of the teachers against some things which have been happening. So I think, yes, individual teachers and schools and so on can resist, but I think the resistance needs to be very powerful because there are huge forces at play. And I think it's the collective and the collaborative, like the Save Our Schools, which is a particular interest group, think tank in Australia, does great work on inequity. And as I said, I think the teacher unions are recognising and acknowledging the significance of research to help them frame up policies and so on. And I do think, Barbik, the first response of nations to COVID, to me, seemed to be almost a return to a sort of Keynesianism, a recognition of more government expenditure. And even if you look at what President Biden has done in the US, I mean, I can't imagine. I could imagine what a billion is, but a trillion, and the amount of money they're putting in to develop infrastructure, restructure schooling, etc. So we are at a moment which I think some sort of manifesto of a way forward, and particularly in relation to privatisation, commercialisation and schooling systems and schools, and in relation to the whole human capital frame and test frame, and the question of inequality. I think they're floating around now, and it's an interesting moment for a sort of collective resistance to some of those things. I don't know, I always think we have to hold on to hope in some way and have resources of hope. And I hope our research can contribute to those resources. And it was Raymond Williams who said, progressive politics is about making hope practical rather than despair convincing. And I think there's some real truth in that aphorism.
Thanks a lot, Bob. It has been a great pleasure talking to you today, and thanks for making the time for this conversation.
And thank you, Barbik.